Name of person, Pham Thanh Dan. David, the name of the main character of the story. Phan Quai Bu, Ben, the name of David's cellmate, an exorcist. Bao Ngok, Ruby, David's daughter's name. Mr. Hung, Mr. Mason, the name of a man in the neighborhood whose son is sick. Kwong Clark, the name of the possessed student. Grandma Dung Daisy, Tony's mother's name. Tony, Daisy's son's name. Exorcist title focuses on horror and thriller elements. Haunted in the Mirror, Ghost of Vengeance. The Ghost Bound, The Horrifying Secret After Death. The Curse of the Dead, Relentless Vengeance. Ghost Pursuit, Nights of Haunting Horror. Our Haunted Canal, Endless Horror. Title evokes curiosity and mystery. Secrets After Death, The Horrifying Hidden Truth. Mysterious Curse, Who Will Pay the Price? Ghost Returns, What Awaits? The Haunted House, Forgotten Horror, Past. The Restless Souls, What Do They Want? Our channel. Episode 131, Getting Out of Prison to Revenge Life, a huge horror ghost story. McDavid, full 4K, YouTube, https, www.youtube.com, watch, V40JQV, CTFBA. Transcript, welcome to our channel, the world of ghosts and demons. If this is your first time visiting, hello, I am David, the owner of this place. Please come in, I will take you to meet the spirits. Now, without making you wait any longer, please follow today's story right away. David was an orphan from birth. According to the story, he was found in a stinking trash can, bitten by a swarm of fire ants, causing his whole body to swell up, his eyes to ooze yellow pus, and he had only a small breath left. No one knew how long he had been in the trash can, only that when he was rescued, one of his fingers had been severed and was missing, probably eaten by rats. At that time, everyone thought he would die, but in the end, he miraculously survived. After that, he was sent to an orphanage. Life in the orphanage was not easy. He was fought over by other children for food and beaten. The harshness of life made him even more callous and cold. At the age of 12, he was fortunate to be adopted by a middle-aged woman. The name David was given to him by this adoptive mother. His adoptive mother was a woman over 40 years old who had just lost both her husband and child in a traffic accident. He thought his life could be better, but unexpectedly, those happy days only lasted 2 years. Not long after adopting him, his mother was diagnosed with terminal liver cancer and passed away. A few months later, this foster mother was just a poor tailor, and her family was not wealthy. When she fell ill, all the money in the house was spent on medical treatment until she passed away. David had only 200,000 VND left in his pocket and a small house less than 70 square meters wide. That was all the property his foster mother left him. Alone, David decided to drop out of school and took the 200,000 VND to start working to earn money. At first, he learned from people who sold lottery tickets on the street. The money he earned was not much, but it was enough to get by. Later, a couple selling noodles saw him wandering around, so out of pity, they took him in as a shop assistant. When he grew up, he switched to parking, serving at coffee shops and pubs. When he was 17, David saved up a small amount of capital, bought an old motorbike, and switched to working as a motorbike taxi driver. David struggled to get out into society early, so he was very worldly. Despite that, he never fell into social evils because he was aware that he was lonely, and if he touched that trash, his life would end. When David was 21, fate brought him to meet a girl 5 years older than him, who worked as a worker in an industrial park. Because they were both equally poor and David had no relatives, the couple just moved in together without registering their marriage or getting married properly. Just like that, the woman became his illegitimate wife. Very quickly, his wife became pregnant, which made David extremely happy. To earn money to take care of his wife and children, he threw himself into working like a madman, plowing harder than a buffalo or a cow in the field. Before, it was fine to be alone, but now his wife and children were his motivation to strive. He could go hungry, but his child absolutely could not be thirsty for milk. Every day, he worked continuously for 14 to 15 hours, almost exhausting himself. Later, David's wife gave birth to a baby girl, his precious first child. She was named Ruby. It was thought that the family of 3 would always be happy like that. Despite being poor, they had each other. But no, God always made fun of David's life. The innocent wife of David, because she could not bear the poverty and hardship, left home to follow her new lover, heartlessly abandoning their baby, who was only a few months old. So David had to marry and raise his child himself. That time was miserable in every way. The child missed her mother and was thirsty for milk, so she cried all day. The baby was sick all the time and went in and out of the hospital continuously. On normal days, David would carry Ruby on his back, taking the baby with him to work as a motorbike taxi driver to earn a living when she was only 6 months old at that time. When the weather changed, David would leave the baby with some students who rented a room near the church to look after. When he brought the baby to work as a motorbike taxi driver, some people sympathized with the situation of the father and daughter, but there were also people who looked down on him, even maliciously saying that David did it just to show off to gain people's pity, taking advantage of the child to earn money. Not to mention the time he was unlucky enough to be robbed. They robbed him until he had no money left in his pocket. He had to hug the devil and cry, begging them not to take the motorbike because it was the means of livelihood for the father and daughter. Even robbers know how to sympathize with people and cannot bear to take away the motorbike, but the biological mother had the heart to abandon her newborn baby. But no matter how miserable people are, time does not slow down. From the moment Ngok became aware of everything around her, she loved her father and was extremely obedient. Although poor, David still sent his daughter to school. In his heart, David always thought that knowing enough was enough. Although he was poor, at least he had a house to live in and food to eat, which was better than many people. So David never complained about his fate. Happiness and suffering, sadness and suffering. So why do we choose sadness when the result is the same? It is better to choose happiness and optimism to live. However, the incident never let David go. When Ngok was in 7th grade, on the way home from school, she was beaten by a young man who took turns doing bad things. When David heard the news and ran to the scene, he saw with his own eyes his daughter naked, with a bruised face. After that incident, Ngok fell into severe depression, showing signs of mental illness, and then she hanged herself before she was 14 years old. Extremely bitter, Ngok's death was like an end to David's life. He could no longer accept this damn life. He had never done anything evil nor harmed anyone, yet all he received was bitterness and pain. At that time, the police could not find the murderer. Without waiting for the police, David frantically searched for the person who killed his daughter to take revenge, and then David actually killed a young man. Luckily, the young man did not die, but was disabled by more than 50% and could not recover. At the trial, David learned that he had killed the wrong person. He was charged with many crimes, the most serious of which was intentional murder. At 36 years old, David was sentenced to 8 years in prison. Not even half a lifetime had passed, but David had already experienced life and death, imprisonment. Now he was all alone, and life had no meaning anymore. In prison, David always felt guilty because the young man was innocent. He wished he could stay in prison forever or even die in prison because there was nothing left to regret in life. David lived aimlessly like a soulless corpse until he met Ben, 64 years old, a man sentenced to life in prison for killing his son and daughter-in-law. Ben was an exorcist. He had been in prison for nearly 10 years. He, like David, was forced to kill. From that sympathy, David and Ben quickly bonded and became soulmates. Ben offered to accept David as his disciple to teach him the Dharma. He said, "You and I meeting in this prison is considered fate. God has eyes, You were only in prison for 8 years, and I don't want the Dharma to be lost. Well, now I will pass on all my life's work to you. After you get out of prison, you can use this magic to save people. I know your nature is not bad anyway. Your life is ruined. If you can't start your life over, then save someone else's life. Thanks to what Ben said, David realized many things. He decided to reform, try to save people, to dedicate to his daughter's soul in heaven. The first step to learning the Dharma, there was one thing that David had to absolutely follow, which was to absolutely not use the Dharma to do bad things or harm people. Even Ben only dared to use his bare hands to kill people. If at that time he dared to use magic, he would not have ended up in prison like now. The reason was because Ben had made a blood pact with his master. If he harmed someone, he would immediately be tortured to death by the underworld. After death, he would not be reincarnated, but would become a lonely ghost. David also had to make a blood contract. Otherwise, even if he studied for a lifetime, the spell wouldn't work. Of course, David agreed. To make the contract, Ben secretly took toilet paper and used a ballpoint pen to draw a spell, burned it, and mixed it with a cup of water. Then he used a razor blade to cut his finger and drop 3 drops of his blood into the cup of water containing the spell. Then he used the water in the cup to draw a yin-yang circle on the ground, and at the same time told David to cut the tip of each finger and drop a drop of blood directly onto the yin-yang circle he had just drawn. David saw with his own eyes that the blood disappeared without a trace as soon as it touched the ground, as if it had been sucked underground. Ben handed David the cup of water with the spell and his blood and said, "Drink it all." David drank it all without hesitation. From then on, the contract was made. During his years in prison, David diligently studied Taoism. Ben taught David everything he knew, from summoning spirits, capturing ghosts, to raising witchcraft, controlling ghost soldiers, and performing magic spells. Thanks to that, 8 years in prison passed very quickly, and in the blink of an eye, David was free. After being released from prison, David returned to his old house. Looking at his daughter's altar covered in dust and cobwebs due to no one taking care of the incense and candles for many years, the father's tears streamed down his cheeks. Now that David had a religious body, he made a seal and knew that Ruby's soul was still wandering in the world and had not yet been able to reach nirvana. He was even more determined to do good deeds to dedicate the merits to his daughter, to help her reincarnate soon. Before that, for some unknown reason, David had tried 3 times to call his daughter's soul back, but failed, which made him feel very uneasy. In the early days after his release from prison, because of the name David had for killing a prisoner, the neighbors all avoided David. No one dared to come near. During that time, David cleaned up the house and set up an altar to worship the ancestors. In no time, the house was filled with incense smoke. Until one day, in the neighborhood, a student named Clark, who rented a room near David's house, was possessed by a spirit. Many people in the neighborhood came to see. Regarding the spirit, of course, David was also there. At first glance, David knew that the spirit possessing Clark's body was a female spirit who committed suicide in the very room Clark was renting. This was not an act of disrespect, but simply a female spirit who was infatuated and wanted to take Clark as her husband. This spirit was an evil spirit. At this moment, Clark was screaming like crazy, smashing things, cursing loudly like a madman. No one could stop him. Clark's strength was very strong at this moment. 3 or 4 tall young men held him down, but it was no use. The onlookers were all in an uproar, especially the landlady. Her face turned pale with fear. Seeing that something was wrong, David stepped out from the crowd and shouted loudly, "Hey you, have you made enough trouble? Do you see me here?" Clark was screaming when he heard David's voice. He suddenly stopped and glared around. As soon as he saw David, Clark suddenly jumped up, walked backwards, and then slowly sat down in fear. He quickly hid under the bed trembling as he said, "Please forgive me. I won't dare to make trouble again. Don't arrest me." As soon as he finished speaking, the spirit came out and ran away, and Clark fainted under the bed. Everyone looked at David with their mouths wide open. After that, the whole neighborhood rumored that David was an exorcist. Whenever there was anything related to spirituality, people would seek David's help. And every time David saved someone, it was true. Of course, there are those who believe and those who don't. Many people think that David is a drug dealer, has been imprisoned, and is also a fraud. Until one day, Mr. Mason's family in the neighborhood brought their crazy son to David for help. Mr. Mason's son is only 27 years old this year, originally a tall, strong young man. But 5 years ago, he unfortunately drowned and almost died. Luckily, he was saved in time, so he still survived. The doctor said there was no health problem, but they don't understand why Mr. Mason's son has become crazy since then. The family took him to see a shaman several times, but the shaman said that he was dragged into the water by a ghost. If he could be saved, he would be considered a great man, but the ghost had taken 2 souls and refused to return them. Mr. Mason's family spent a lot of money for the shaman to perform a ceremony to get his soul back, but it was all in vain. When the people in the neighborhood heard that Mr. Mason's family came to ask David to save their son, everyone pouted and did not believe that David could save him. Because Mr. Mason's son had been crazy for 5 years now, the family invited countless high-level exorcists, but they were all helpless, so how could David save him? Yet after only 3 short days of spiritual healing at David's house, Mr. Mason's son suddenly returned to normal. Before, he didn't even recognize his parents, but now he even remembered the neighbor's dog's name, completely alert like a normal person. Needless to say, the whole neighborhood was shocked. Now, he couldn't help but believe it. 5 years ago, David was still in prison, so how could he know anything about Mr. Mason's son? And yet he was cured immediately. Mr. Mason's family almost knelt down to thank David. Mr. Mason offered 50 million, but David didn't accept a single penny. Thanks to that, people began to believe that David was really a high-level exorcist. 1 told 10, 10 told 100. The number of people coming to David for help increased day by day. People from other places heard of David's reputation and came to him. Every day, people came in and out of his house continuously. Gradually, people called him Master David. Not only did David save people, he was not greedy for money and did not accept money in exchange. David placed a donation box in front of his house, and whoever wanted to give money could put it in the box. There were many poor people who had no money, and people only put 5,000 or 10,000 in the box, and he did not care. In just 2 or 3 years, people had long forgotten that David had been in prison for murder, and only Master David remained, virtuous and doing good deeds to save people. David only kept a small amount of money in the donation box to cover household expenses, and donated the rest to the temple as his daughter. One day, before 7 a.m., there were already 6 people standing in line, waiting for their turn to see the monk. Normally, it would be first come, first served, but that day, David suddenly pointed at a young man and hurriedly called him inside. The people who arrived first saw this and were annoyed and complained, "Hey, monk, this kid came later. I came first. Why did you let him in first?" David replied, "You guys let him go. He's in a hurry. I'll save the person first." Following the young man was a middle-aged woman, and when asked, it turned out that they were a mother and son. The mother's name was Daisy, and the son's name was Tony. Before Daisy could say anything, David spoke first. "I saw that this boy was being followed by 2 ghosts, a female ghost and an old man's ghost. The female ghost had become a ghost. It was not a normal ghost that died on the street, but a ghost that died unjustly, with a very heavy resentment. It had some kind of hatred towards this boy, so it followed him to take revenge. This girl is very fierce. She's been following him for several years. She should have captured his soul long ago, but luckily, the old man's ghost saved her several times. This old man is a relative. Wearing a patient's outfit, she has caused several accidents, but he only broke his arms and legs, right? As soon as David finished speaking, Mrs. Daisy opened her mouth in disbelief. The teacher said every word exactly. The old man's spirit wearing a patient's clothes was Tony's grandfather. He died of a serious illness and was still wearing his patient's clothes. Mrs. Daisy knew she had found the right person. She kowtowed and begged David for help. Before coming here, Mrs. Daisy had asked for help from dozens of exorcists, but no one dared to accept it. People said that the female spirit was a demon that no one could control. For the past few years, it had tormented Tony, making him unable to eat, drink, or sleep. From a young man who weighed over 80 kilos and was nearly 1 weight tall, Tony was now only 50 kilong, skinny as a skeleton. Every night, the female ghost possessed Tony's body to cause trouble, even cursing and beating his parents, not allowing him to rest for a single day. David hesitated for a long time because this female ghost was really fierce. David's magic could only fight on par with her, not sure if he could win. Once he agreed to help, even the slightest mistake would result in the demon killing him. Very dangerous. But now, the person in trouble was right before his eyes. Could he just watch her die and not save her and leave her in misery? Daisy and her son were still kowtowing and begging continuously. Finally, David agreed to save Tony. David told Daisy that he would perform a ceremony to temporarily lock up the female ghost, although she would soon escape, but he had to do it first to give Tony time to recover, and also to let David think of a way to deal with the ghost. If he let it haunt him endlessly like this, he was afraid that Tony would not be able to bear it and die young. After talking to Mrs. Daisy, David told Tony to lie down and used his index and middle fingers to press on the bridge of his nose, along with Tony's 2 palms and 2 soles. Next, he took out a small ceramic pot, drew a spell on the pot, and slowly stretched the mouth of the pot from the top of Tony's head to the bottom of his feet. Then, David took out a red cloth from his pocket and covered the mouth of the pot. At this moment, the ceramic pot shook violently as if something was about to escape. David quickly took out a string made from mulberry trees and tied it tightly to the ceramic pot. Daisy slowly slowed down and lay still in David's hands. After finishing, David told Mrs. Daisy to take Tony home to rest for a month and then come back to continue working. It was true that after returning from Master David's house, Tony was much more alert and could eat and sleep well. After 28 days, something happened again. One afternoon, while Tony was still alert, the female demon suddenly appeared in broad daylight and grabbed Tony's neck. She even cursed and threatened to kill Tony. Hearing his cries for help, the family rushed over and saw Tony strangling himself with his hands, refusing to let go, squeezing so hard that his face turned blue and purple, and his tongue was sticking out. The family had to hold Tony down and pull his hands away to save him. Tony fainted on the spot and had to be taken to the emergency room. Mrs. Daisy rushed to see Master David. When David checked the ceramic jar, the red cloth had been thrown off, so the demon had escaped. It would definitely find a way to capture Tony's soul as soon as possible. He had to quickly make a talisman to protect Tony from the demon's body. David took out a pen and paper to write down Tony's birth chart, then made a talisman and gave Mrs. Daisy 12 talismans, including 3 red talismans and 9 yellow talismans. David instructed her, "Take these 12 talismans home, burn one of the 3 red ones every day, and mix it with water for the little boy to drink. Remember to drink it at exactly 12 noon for the talisman to be effective. Divide the 9 yellow ones into 3, burn 3 each time, and mix them with water for the little boy to bathe in. Drink it while bathing for 3 consecutive days. This talisman is very strong. Drinking it will have side effects. The female demon will torture herself and resist at all costs. You must force the little boy to do exactly what I say to save him." Mrs. Daisy brought the amulet home and followed exactly what Master David had instructed. On the first day, at exactly 12 noon, right after drinking the amulet, Tony had a seizure, foaming at the mouth, his eyes rolled back, and drool running down his face. Mrs. Daisy felt sorry for her son and cried while encouraging him. Try to overcome it. Tony was tormented by the amulet for 2 hours before he calmed down. Mrs. Daisy continued to bathe her son in the amulet water. Wherever the water poured, David became cold to the bone, his hands and feet trembled, and his teeth chattered. That night, Mrs. Daisy had to get 2 cotton blankets to cover her son. On the second day, after drinking the spell, Tony continued to have convulsions, almost biting his tongue. Mrs. Daisy had to stuff a cloth into his son's mouth. After a while of convulsions, Tony had another headache, so much so that he had to bang his head on the ground, his mouth constantly crying for help. The spell tormented him from 12 noon to 7 p.m. until Tony could no longer bear it and passed out from exhaustion. When Mrs. Daisy took off her son's clothes to prepare for a spell bath, she discovered that Tony's back was covered with red rashes. This second day, Tony's torment was worse than the first day. Worried, Mrs. Daisy ran to see David to ask about the situation. What happened to Tony was exactly as David had predicted. That's good. It proves that the charm is effective, he replied to Mrs. Daisy. Because your son has been followed by a female demon for a long time, he has accumulated a lot of yin energy in his body. This charm is pure yang entering the body and encountering yin on both sides. The yin energy is pushed back out from the back, which is why he has a red rash. I told you in advance that the third day is very important. Success or failure depends on this time. No matter what happens, you must force the boy to drink the charm and bathe in the charm. The female demon will definitely come to destroy him. There is only one more day. Try your best. After the third day, everything will be fine. On the third day, at exactly 12 o'clock, Mrs. Daisy burned a charm for Tony to drink, but it was not as smooth as the previous 2 days. On the third day, Tony protested and refused to drink the charm. He cried and said, I beg you, I will not drink the charm anymore. Mum, if I drink anymore, I will die. I will die to please you. After saying that, Tony ran out, but Mrs. Daisy had locked the door in advance, so Tony could not escape. Everyone in the house joined together to tie Tony up, despite his struggles. Mrs. Daisy squeezed her son's mouth and poured spoonfuls of the charm into it. After drinking the spell, blood flowed out of Tony's 7 orifices. This time, Tony did not have a seizure, but his eyes rolled back, his mouth opened, and he sat motionless like a soulless person. Mrs. Daisy continued to burn the last 3 spells and mixed them into warm water for Tony to bathe in. When she finished, she saw that the pain had lessened, and she breathed a sigh of relief. In the following days, Tony's entire body began to bruise. At that time, Mrs. Daisy did not think much of it, because Master David had told him to stay home and recuperate. Right now, Tony's body was too weak to do anything more. When the opportunity came, Master David would proactively contact him. Daisy tried her best to nourish her son, but somehow Tony's health became worse and worse. Every day, by late afternoon, Tony would have bleeding in his 7 orifices, and after 10 p.m., he would have a stomachache. In addition, there was a very strange thing. Tony could only eat the meat of legless animals like eels and fish, and could not eat chicken, pork, or beef. If he ate just one wrong piece, Tony would vomit all day long for 2 months. The bruises on Tony's body became more and more serious. Although he was no longer haunted by ghosts, Tony began to become absent-minded, his eyes lifeless. Mrs. Daisy felt something was wrong. In addition, it had been almost 2 months since Mr. David had contacted her. Mrs. Daisy was anxious, so she went to see Mr. David to ask about her son's condition, but he was not home. Mrs. Daisy went to see him 3 times in total, but could not see him all 3 times. So when Tony suddenly fell seriously ill, bedridden, and unable to move, at first a small ulcer appeared on Tony's stomach, and then it gradually spread. Within just 2 days of the onset of the disease, the ulcer was larger than the palm of a person. Mrs. Daisy continued to look for him for the 4th time until the door was still closed. Mrs. Daisy asked around, and people living nearby said that they did not know where Mr. David had been for the past 2 months and had not been home. Many people came to see him, but no one could meet him. The family took Tony to the hospital. After the diagnosis, the doctor said that Tony had stomach cancer that had metastasized to the final stage. Now, they could only try to use medicine to prolong his life, but could no longer treat it. After receiving the results from the doctor, Mrs. Daisy was completely paralyzed. All of a sudden, after only a few months, her son had cancer, and it was in the final stage. The doctor refused to treat him. Mrs. Daisy cried and did not know what was happening. Her son was about to die, and Master David had disappeared without a trace. She had to ask around and was directed to another master who lived in the mountains. Mrs. Daisy did not hesitate to travel far to see him and ask for help. After hearing Tony's story, the master just shook his head and said, "You can go home. I can't save your son. He has been bewitched." The person who cast the spell was a very skilled exorcist. This spell must be directly introduced into the body for 3 consecutive days to be effective. Think about it. Has your son eaten or drunk anything strange for 3 consecutive days? The spell must have been in your son's body for more than 50 days. His life is over. Only the person who cast the spell can save him. On the way back from the master's house, Mrs. Daisy was completely absent-minded. What the master on the mountain said kept ringing in her ears, like leading the spell directly into the body. The high-level exorcist, eating something for 3 consecutive days, being under a spell for more than 50 days. Putting all those words together, wasn't he talking about Master David? So all this time, mother and daughter had been led by the nose by that damned swindler. Mrs. Daisy thought for a long time, but still couldn't understand what motivated him to do that when he had never asked for money or anything. But Mrs. Daisy quickly put aside all her doubts. Her son's life was the most important thing now. No matter what the reason was, there was not much time left. She had to find a swindler to remove the spell. Thinking and doing, Mrs. Daisy led people to David's house. Of course, there was still no one at home. This time, Mrs. Daisy did not care about anything. She suspected that David was hiding in the house, so she had someone break down the door. The loud noise alarmed the neighbors around. People started to come to see. When the door was broken down, everyone froze on the spot, including Mrs. Daisy, because David had already died. When he died, his eyes were wide open. The blood flowing from his 7 orifices had long since dried and turned black. His body was watery and slimy. His body was swollen. His skin and flesh were limp. His anus was defecating uncontrollably, and many places were infested with maggots. The police were called to the scene immediately afterwards to conduct an autopsy. The results showed that David had been dead for nearly 10 days. The cause was a heart attack. Because David was dead, there was no one left in the world who could save Daisy's son's life. Tony struggled with illness, and after 3 months of struggling, he died. So what was the cause of all this tragedy? It must be said that the first time David saw Tony, the reason David called Tony in first was because David saw the spirit of Ruby, his daughter, following Tony to take revenge. That proved that Tony was the one who beat and raped Ruby, causing her to commit suicide, and was also the one who ruined David's life. The hatred that had been dormant for many years suddenly awakened. Heaven had eyes. The enemy had come to pay his own way. Taking advantage of Daisy's trust and admiration, David devised a plan for revenge, luring her into a trap and forcing her to kill her own son. First, David said he would lock up the ghost, but in reality, he was locking up David's grandfather's spirit, preventing him from getting in the way. Next, David placed a red seal on Tony's forehead, palms, and soles of his feet to prevent Ruby from entering Tony's body to take revenge. Ruby is dead. If she continues to harm others now, she will accumulate a lot of karma, making it harder for her to reincarnate. David will personally avenge his daughter after successfully gaining Daisy's trust. David asked for a horoscope to cast a spell to kill Tony, regardless of the blood contract. Even if he could never reincarnate and became a ghost soldier under the command of another exorcist, he would be willing, as long as he could take revenge. As long as Tony died, all the sacrifices would be worth it. David used Daisy's hand to direct the spell directly into Tony's body and told Daisy that when the time came, he would come to save Tony. But in reality, it was to prolong the time so that the spell would penetrate deep into Tony's blood, destroying his internal organs. After only 50 days, no exorcist in the world could save him anymore. After 3 days of casting the spell, Tony suffered extreme pain, writhing and destroying his entire body. David knew that, so he played a psychological trick to make Daisy believe that if she forced her son to drink the spell, he would be saved, not knowing that she had pushed her son to death. David's plan was so sophisticated that he successfully led Mrs. Daisy by the nose, making her foolishly listen to all his arrangements. When Mrs. Daisy successfully led the spell into Tony's body, David was tormented by the underworld. When Mrs. Daisy came to the house and couldn't find him, it was because David was lying there waiting to die, not because he was hiding on purpose. No one knew that Mr. David had died until Mrs. Daisy had someone break down the door, and that was the whole root cause of this tragic ending. As for Ben, because he had made a blood pact with David, the moment David died was also a karma that everyone had to pay, something that could not be avoided. In the last days of his life, David saw his daughter's spirit by his side, and that was enough to satisfy him. But for some reason, he did not feel relieved. The only thing he regretted in his entire life was trying to survive when he was picked up from the trash. He should have just died then. Then his life would not have been so miserable. Before he died, David left a will that he wanted to sell his house and donate all the money to an orphanage, with David meaning the donor was Ruby. However, this wish could not be fulfilled because after his death, his and his daughter's souls kept wandering around the house. People living nearby all saw 2 shadows flying back and forth in the abandoned house. People in the neighborhood were afraid that the 2 ghosts in the house would escape and destroy the village, so they asked for charms to stick around the house. Rumors about the house being haunted spread everywhere, so no one dared to buy or sell anything. Today's story ends here. Thank you for listening to all of you. I don't know what you think, what your views are on the characters and the content of this story. Please leave your comments. We will discuss and discuss together. Thank you again. I wish you a good night's sleep. See you again on the next broadcast on our channel.